Alright, in section 5.6a we are going to talk about graphing linear inequalities. So it's going to be very similar to graphing our linear equations, but this time we're going to add another step with the inequality. So our first step is to write the inequality in slope-intercept form, just like we were doing before. Then our next step, number 2, is to determine the slope, which is our m, and the y-intercept, which is our 0, b. Once we have those, we can graph the y-intercept and that point on the y-axis, just like we were doing before. That's our first step. Then number 4, use our slope to rise and then run in order to graph our second point. Now up to this point, it has been the same process as our linear equations. We've been doing the same thing. The next step, though, is to determine if our line will be solid or dotted. So if we have a solid line, that means our inequality is going to look like this, either less than or equal to or greater than or equal to. And if there's no line underneath, we will use these symbols, less than or equal to. No line underneath is dotted. Okay, then once we determine if it's solid or dotted, we are going to determine our last step, see if the shading will be above or below the line. If it is going to be above, that means it is facing this way, either with an equal sign or not. It is greater than. If it is below, then we have a less than equation. So let's look at some examples. Example 1 here, our first step, put it in slope-intercept form, which it is. It's in slope-intercept form. That means my b is 3, and my slope is 1, since there's a 1 out in front of that x. So then my next step is to graph my slope. So I'm going to go up 3, 1, 2, 3, since I have a positive 3 as my b. And then my slope is a positive 1. So if m is 1 over 1, that means I'm going to go up 1 and over 1. Okay, so now I have my 2 points graphed. My next step is to determine if I'm going to have a dotted or a dotted or a solid line. In order to determine that, I'm going to look at my sign. Since there is no line underneath, this means I'm going to have a dotted line. So I'm going to connect these lines with a dashed line all the way through the graph. Okay, and then finally, step 6, determine if the shading will be above or below the boundary line. Since I have a greater than symbol, this means it is going to be above. So then my last step, I can shade in everything above that dotted line. And that is how we graph the linear inequality. Okay, so let's try another one. Number 2, my b is a negative 1, and my slope is negative 2. So that means I have negative 2 over 1. So let's do the first step, graph my y-intercept. If b is negative 1, that means I'm going down 1. My slope is a negative 2, so I'm going to go down 2, 1, 2 over 1. Next, I'm going to look at my inequality sign. this tells me that I have a solid line, and since it is less than, it is going to be below. So I can graph my solid line all the way through my graph, and if it is below, that means I'm going to shade everything underneath my line. So if we look at these two graphs, if we look at our graph from number 1, that dotted line means that my answers, my x's and y y's, cannot be on that line. They can be anything that is above, anything that is in that blue region would be a point that would make my equation true. If I look at my graph for number 2, same thing, anything in that shaded region would make my equation true up here, but this time, since I have a solid line, I could include any points that are on that line, but no points that are above. Okay, so let's look at a few more examples. For number 3, if I look at this equation, it is not in y-intercept form. Y is not by itself. So the first thing I need to do for number 3 is to get y by itself. Get my equation into the correct form. So to get y by itself here, I have to get rid of everything that is on that side with y. I need to start with what's furthest away. So if I do that, I'm going to subtract 3x from both sides. 3x minus 3x is 0. Left with 2y is less than minus 3x minus 6. Then to get rid of that 2 out front of my y, I'm going to divide both sides by 2. Get y is less than negative 3 over 2x minus 3. Now I'm ready to graph because I have my y-intercept, which is negative 3. So I'm going to do that first. Go down 1, 2, 3. Then I'm going to look at my slope, which is negative 3 over 2. So again, I'm going to go down 1, 2, 3 over 1, 2. Now that I have my 2 points, I can look at my inequality. Since I have no line underneath, that means I'm going to have a dotted line. And since I have a dotted line here, since I have my less than symbol, that means I'm going to shade below. So then everything underneath that line gets shaded because any of those points would make my equation true. Okay, let's look at number 4. Again, number 4, it is not in slope-intercept form. Y is not by itself. So I need to first get y by itself. In order to get y by itself, I'm going to divide by a negative 2 on both sides. Now remember, when we divide by a negative number, when you multiply or divide by a negative number, you must flip the sign. So when we do that, we get y is less than or equal to positive 4x. Now y is by itself. If I look, I have nothing over here for my b, so that means my b is 0. It's going to be right at the origin, 0, 0. Then my slope is 4, which is really 4 over 1. Go up 1, 2, 3, 4 over 1. Next, I'm going to look at my inequality, and I have to look at the inequality of my equation in slope-intercept form. I can't look back up at the original. In slope-intercept form, my inequality is less than or equal to, so that is going to be solid. And if it is less than, that means I'm going to shade below. Okay, next question, number 5. Again, my first step here is to get y by itself. But if you look at number 5, there is no y. So instead of getting y by itself, I'm going to get x by itself. To do that, I need to divide by 4. Since I'm dividing by a positive 4, I'm going to keep that sign the same. Get a negative 3. X is greater than negative 3. When we graph x is greater than negative 3, it's going to be just like graphing if it was x equals negative 3. We're going to start at x is 3. I'm going to put a point right there. Now I know if x equals negative 3, this is going to be a vertical line. In order to determine what kind of line, I need to look at my inequality. Since there is no line, this tells me it is going to be a dotted line. So I'm going to draw my dotted line at x equals 3. Now, this is harder to determine above or below the line, but if we have x is greater than negative 3, that means x is going to be bigger than negative 3. So if x is bigger than negative 3, I'm going to shade in everything where x is greater than negative 3. That means I'm shading everything to the right. Okay, for our last example, number 6, negative 2y is greater than or equal to negative 6. The first thing I want to do is get y by itself. So if I have negative 2 times y, the opposite of multiplication is division. When I do that, I am dividing by a negative number. So just like above, we must flip the sign. Then we have negative 6 divided by negative 2 gives me 3. Just like I did over here with my vertical line, if I have y is less than or greater than or is equal to, this means I'm going to have a horizontal line. Y is greater than 3, positive 3, so I'm going to put my first point at positive 3. And before I draw my line, I need to determine what kind of line. If my inequality has a line underneath, that means it is going to be a solid line. That means y can equal 3. And then my last step is to determine the shading. If it is less than or equal to, that means it is going to be below my line. Anything where y is less than 3 could be part of my answer.